Today's guest lecturer is an associate professor at the University of Nottingham. He specializes in Islamic intellectual history, medieval Islamic theology and philosophy, Christian Muslim relations, and the thought of Ibn Taymiyya. He is the author of Ibn Taymiyya's Perpetual Optimism, and numerous articles and book chapters of Ibn Taymiyya's Theology and Ethics. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jon Hoover.
Thank you very much. So, thank you to Markfeild Institute of Higher Education for this invitation. Thank you all for coming out. And talking about Ibn Taymiyya, I assume Ibn Taymiyya needs relatively little introduction, but he was a 14th century reformer from Damascus. He's famous for fighting against the Mongols who were invading from the east, and for agitating against religious innovations. Now, as you see on the screen, my topic for today is Ibn Taymiyya and Sufism revisited. The question of Ibn Taymiyya's relation to Sufism has been much discussed in the academic literature, and there is now something of a scholarly consensus that Ibn Taymiyya did not condemn Sufism completely, despite what you might read in the internet popular circles. Rather, he adopted certain aspects of Sufi piety and asceticism, and he condemned others. However, there is no clear consensus on whether Ibn Taymiyya himself was a Sufi. The American scholar George Makdisi claimed in 1973 in an article that Ibn Taymiyya himself was indeed a Sufi. And while this claim has been criticized, some scholars affirm it. And my aim in this talk is to revisit the question of Ibn Taymiyya's spirituality and his relationship to Sufism, and perhaps shed a little bit more light on this question of whether he was a Sufi or not. So, to make sense of Ibn Taymiyya's relation to Sufis, we first need to understand his spirituality. His spirituality revolves around worship, or ibadah. Ibn Taymiyya writes the following: the entirety of the religion has two principles: that we worship God alone, and that we worship him only by means of what he has legislated. We do not worship him by means of innovations. So the proper end, the telos of humankind is undivided worship of God. The proper way to worship is to obey God's law, and everything outside God's law is innovation, or bid'ah. Ibn Taymiyya links his two principles to worship, or his two principles of worship, to what it means to be human, to what it means to be a creature created by God. Human nature for Ibn Taymiyya is dynamic and goal-oriented. Every living being has a motive force, a spirituality, a life energy, which Ibn Taymiyya calls variously love, or obedience, or will, or even worship. This life energy is always oriented toward some end. This is unavoidable. You cannot escape having a goal, or a telos. It also necessarily follows a path. This life energy, or this love, follows a path or a pattern of life as it moves toward that goal. The proper end of this vital force is God, and the proper path is the law of Islam. And Ibn Taymiyya elaborates this in the following quotation from his book on Law, Kitab al-Mahabba. So there are three parts to the quotation. The first reads, every living being must have an object of love, which is the goal of its love and its will, and toward which its inner and outer movements are directed. That is its God. So everybody has a God, no matter how they might worship or how they might devote their energies. He continues, every religion, every obedience, every love must have two things. The first is the object of religion, love, and obedience. This is the object of intention and the object of will. The second is the form of the deeds by which that object is obeyed and worshipped. This is the way, the path, the law, the method, the means of access. And he continues a little bit further along, clarifying exactly what he means with respect to himself. Religion encompasses two things, the object of worship and the worship. The object of worship is the one God. Worship is obeying him and obeying his messenger. This is the religion of God with which he is well pleased. As he said, I am well pleased with Islam as a religion for you. So as we see here, love, worship, religion, and obedience are the very essence of life. You cannot escape worshiping. You cannot escape loving. You cannot escape obeying something. Ibn Taymiyya does not confine love, worship, and religion to the private sphere. Living beings necessarily love and worship something in everything they do. The question is not whether they will worship, love, and obey, it is what they will worship and how. For Ibn Taymiyya, God is the only beneficial object of worship, and Islam is the correct method to express this worship or this love. And this brings us back, I think you can see, to Ibn Taymiyya's two principles of religion. One, worship of God alone, and two, worship by means of God's law. Now, love, of course, is prominent in Sufism. And along with love, Ibn Taymiyya also speaks of fear and hope, also found in Sufism. But he doesn't speak of these as stages, so much as stages on a Sufi path, a Sufi spiritual path, but rather they are energies which drive humanity toward God. So the fundamental orientation here for Ibn Taymiyya is ethical, but emotion is not entirely absent. A proper fear of God will frighten away the believer from sin, frighten the believer away from sin and unbelief. A sincere love for God will grow into profound affection and attachment. True hope holds out vision through difficulty. The following passage is indicative of Ibn Taymiyya's reflection on love, hope, and fear. So he writes, know that there are three things that move hearts toward God: love, fear, and hope. The most powerful of them is love. It is sought and desired in itself because it is desired in both this world and the hereafter. This is different from fear, which fades away in the hereafter. The purpose of fear is to deter and to prevent deviation from the path. Love leads the servant on the way to his beloved. His journey to him depends on the degree of its weakness and strength. Fear prevents him from deviating from the path to the beloved, and hope leads him on. Elsewhere, Ibn Taymiyya observes that fear drives one away from God's torment. And as with love, fear, and hope, these all should be, or as with love, fear and hope should all these things should be directed toward God alone. Should not fear a creature. Fear of a creature or hope in a creature apart from God is another form of associating partners with God, or it's another form of shirk. Ultimately, love for God will find its fullest expression in keeping the law given to God's prophet. In the Quran, the prophet was instructed to declare, say, if you love God, then follow me. God will love you and forgive you your sins. So let's look now at some of Ibn Taymiyya's explicit views on different aspects of Sufism. I'd like to start with the great Sufi Ibn Arabi, who died in 1240. So he lived just under a century earlier than Ibn Taymiyya. Now I just want to highlight two things. One is Ibn Arabi's aphoretic character. The aphoretic character of his theology. That aphoretic just means that there's involved paradox or contradiction, depends how you look at it. And then secondly, his view of sainthood. So as for the aphoretic character of his theology, Ibn al-Arabi places ambiguity at the heart of reality. Or another way of saying this is there are always two ways of seeing things. Okay, very briefly, from one perspective, God is completely different from the universe. God and creation are separate. God is totally other. But from the other perspective, there is no existence but God. Other existence only exists by virtue of receiving God's existence. Everything in existence, therefore, is both God and not God. So that's Ibn Arabi in a nutshell. Sorry for the brevity. But it's all about, there's two ways of seeing things. There's ambiguity. You never quite know where you're at. The second thing I want to highlight is Ibn Arabi's view of sainthood. Ibn Arabi had many dreams and visions of spiritual realities that, according to his own understanding, penetrated to truths deeper than those found in the law of Muhammad and rationalist theology. While in his mid-30s, for example, Ibn Arabi had a vision in Mecca which confirmed his status as the supreme seal of Muhammadan sainthood. The Prophet Muhammad was surrounded by angels. He was surrounded by the first 4 Sunni caliphs and all of God's messengers with their various communities. Jesus and Muhammad were talking with each other. And then Muhammad asked Jesus to pull up a seat for guess who? Ibn al-Arabi. Okay, so Jesus pulls up the seat. The seat was designated for the heir of Muhammadan sainthood. Okay, there's this thing called Muhammadan sainthood and sealed in Ibn al-Arabi. The implication is clear. Ibn al-Arabi himself sits at the top of the spiritual hierarchy of the universe. Now, in Ibn al-Arabi's theology, Muhammadan sainthood manifested a pre-existent Muhammadan reality. So there's something larger than this Muhammadan sainthood called the Muhammadan reality. The Muhammadan reality appeared in prophets and saints from Adam on downward through history, through the Prophet Muhammad and onward. The legislative, there is an aspect of this Muhammadan reality though called the legislative side, and this was completed and sealed in the historical Muhammad. So in the 7th century Common Era, the 1st century of the Hijrah, the Hijri era. Okay, so that's the basics. There's more to this actually, but I'm not going to go into it for the sake of not confusing you. This is the core that we need to understand to see what Ibn Taymiyya says about it. In any case, we have Ibn al-Arabi sealing Muhammadan sainthood, and the Prophet Muhammad, historical Prophet Muhammad, sealing legislative prophecy earlier in history. So what's Ibn Taymiyya make of all this? Ibn Taymiyya tells us first that he used to benefit from reading Ibn al-Arabi. He liked Ibn al-Arabi, okay? Let's put that up front. He enjoyed reading his works. But then, when he was 40 years old, he, that is Ibn Taymiyya, turned against the Sufi theologian, and especially his followers. Ibn Taymiyya even thought the followers of Ibn al-Arabi were one of the causes of the Mongol invasions of Syria from 1299 to 1303. And here's a quotation that indicates that. Ibn Taymiyya writes, "Often I thought that the appearance of such as these, that is the followers of Ibn al-Arabi, is one of the main reasons behind the appearance of the Mongols and the obliteration of the law of Islam, and that these are a harbinger, a foretaste, or a foretelling of the lying one-eyed Dajjal, or Antichrist, who claims to be God." So Ibn Taymiyya really came to see that, he perceived that Ibn al-Arabi and his followers were weakening the Islamic society to the point that they became susceptible to the Mongol invasions. But Ibn Taymiyya's primary complaint against Ibn al-Arabi and his followers is that they obliterate the law of Islam. He accuses them of collapsing all distinction between God and the world. They abolish any independent sphere of human moral agency subject to God's command and prohibition. If God and the world are just the same thing, there is no transcendent source of law and morality, and then anything goes. If God and the world are just the same, then how are we to distinguish between what God commands and what God creates? It's just all the same thing. So Ibn Taymiyya approaches, or rather I should say, he appreciates the side of Ibn al-Arabi that distinguishes God and the world. If we go back to the 2 aspects of Ibn al-Arabi that I mentioned earlier, his aphoretic approach to theology. On the one side, God is completely different from the universe, and Ibn Taymiyya says, yeah, this is okay, this is good stuff. But, in fact, he goes, Ibn Taymiyya says that on this side of things, Ibn al-Arabi is closest of his kind to Islam, and he does keep the law. Ibn al-Arabi was known for maintaining the law. He distinguishes between the God who manifests and the things manifested. In other words, God himself who manifests and the created realities which are manifested. Those are distinct. Ibn Taymiyya says that many people profit from Ibn al-Arabi's teaching, even if they don't perceive the other side, which is the pernicious side, the pernicious reality that lies behind all of this. And that reality, according to Ibn Taymiyya, is Ibn al-Arabi's second perspective, the other way of seeing things, which is that all existence are God. There is no existence but God. Ibn Taymiyya accuses Ibn al-Arabi and his followers of propagating the oneness of existence and the unification of God and creation, and their pantheism, as Ibn Taymiyya perceives it. I'm well aware that advocates of Ibn al-Arabi say that Ibn al-Arabi is not a pantheist, but Ibn Taymiyya perceives Ibn al-Arabi from this side of things to be pantheist. And he says Ibn al-Arabi and his followers equate God with all sorts of filth in the world. If God and the world are the same thing, that means that God is the dirtiest thing you can imagine. Also, he erases all distinctions between good and evil. And Ibn Taymiyya is especially disturbed by those who take all of this to extremes. And he singles out the poet, Afif ad-Din at-Tilimsani, who died in 1291 in the Common Era, as the most unbelieving of Ibn al-Arabi's followers. According to Ibn Taymiyya, at-Tilimsani fails to draw any distinction between God and the world whatsoever, and he openly opposes the religious law. And here's what Ibn Taymiyya writes about at-Tilimsani. At-Tilimsani used to make all forbidden things licit, to the point that trustworthy witnesses even reported that he used to say, a girl, her mother, and a non-relative female are all the same. There is nothing forbidden to us in that. And he used to say the whole Quran is polytheism. There is no confession of God's oneness in it. The confession of God's oneness is in what we say. That's Ibn Taymiyya's report of at-Tilimsani. Ibn Taymiyya also has great difficulties with Ibn al-Arabi's theology of sainthood. So this is the second aspect of Ibn al-Arabi that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so I put back up on the screen Ibn al-Arabi's, the basics of sainthood. As I said earlier, there's more complexity to this, but this is what we need to know to understand Ibn Taymiyya's critique. Ibn Taymiyya rejects the idea that revelation of spiritual realities continues on beyond the legislative prophecy sealed in the Prophet Muhammad. It is not permissible that Ibn al-Arabi give priority to his private visions and mystical revelations over reason and the definitive and publicly accessible, that's key, it's publicly accessible and it's reasonable and it's definitive, revelation. So the revelation to the prophet, the revelation of God to the prophet is publicly accessible, it's definitive, and it is reasonable. So Ibn al-Arabi might claim that his revelations came from the same source as the prophet's revelations, but Ibn Taymiyya insists that prophetic revelation must be given priority over the products of mystical imagination. In response to Ibn al-Arabi's elitism and esotericism, Ibn Taymiyya reconfigures the notion of sainthood or wilayah as follows. So he says, first of all, he, as I see on the screen now, he crosses out the top two realities or sainthoods, and he's sticking just with legislative prophecy. And then what distinguishes for Ibn Taymiyya God's saints or friends, or the aliyah, from God's enemies is not exclusive insight into reality or some kind of unique mystical powers, but rather belief in the Prophet Muhammad and obedience to him. Okay, so this brings us to the question of, well, what does Ibn Taymiyya think the law includes? And what does it exclude? What is lawful? What's lawful? Or what is unlawful? What's innovated? So let's look at a common, the common Sufi devotional practice of spiritual concert or sama'. So Ibn Taymiyya on sama'. Sama' is often includes playing musical instruments or clapping hands or dancing. There are different varieties of it, but the aim is some kind of annihilation of the self, kind of from that, and it's there's involving dhikr, remembering God's names and so forth. And we have a picture here which might evoke a sama' session for us.
Whirling
dervishes is one manifestation, but that's not the only manifestation. There are many different manifestations of sama'. So that's just the more well-known. Yeah. So Ibn Taymiyya himself was familiar with this practice, and he relates the following account of his own experience with spiritual concert or sama'. So he writes, in the early part of my life, I found myself with a group of the adherents of asceticism, zuhd, worship, ibadah, and will, that is Sufis. Okay? They were among the best of this kind. We passed the night somewhere. They wanted to perform a spiritual concert or sama, and they wanted me to participate with them. I refused to do that. So they arranged a place for me off to the side, and I sat there. He goes on, when they were performing their spiritual concert and ecstasy and mystical states overtook them, the Grand Sheikh called out to me in his ecstatic state. He said, "You over there, a great fortune, a nasib, has come to you. Come take your fortune, come take your nasib." I said to myself, and then I said openly when we had regathered, when the Samah was over, Ibn Taymiyya says, he said to them, "You can have this fortune. I will not partake in any of a fortune that does not come via the path of Muhammad ibn Abdullah." In other words, the Prophet Muhammad. Ibn Taymiyya continues, it became clear to those among them with awareness and knowledge, in other words, those who knew what was really going on, that others among them were Satan's, shayateen, and others were drunk with wine. The meaning of what I said is that the cause of this fortune, this nasib, or this gift, this present, this mystical state is not lawful. It is not an act of obedience to God and His messenger. The messenger did not legislate it. Now this account is interesting because it shows us that Ibn Taymiyya did spend time with Sufis, at least earlier in his life. He was well acquainted with their practices. Perhaps he even had participated in such rituals earlier. Yet on this occasion, he chose to withdraw, and he condemns this kind of spiritual concert as falling outside the law of God. This fortune, this nasib offered by the Grand Sheikh, comes from dubious sources. Now, this anecdote, the story, appears near the end of a short treatise by Ibn Taymiyya called Ibadat, or worship rituals. And the aim of the treatise is to distinguish worship rituals that are lawful, mashru', from those that are innovated, or they're bid'ah. The distinction between the lawful and the innovated is core to Ibn Taymiyya's vision of Islam. And he envisions a very rich spirituality within the realm of the lawful, within the realm of the mashru'. And that includes a lawful Sufism. At least he talks about the tasawwuf. Lawful rituals bring one near to God. They are the path to God. They are acts of righteousness, obedience, and goodness. Those who follow the way of asceticism, poverty, and Sufism perform these lawful rituals. Some lawful worship rituals are obligatory, like the 5 daily prayers, like fasting the month of Ramadan, giving alms, and traveling to Mecca for the pilgrimage. Other lawful rituals are recommended, like fasting 3 days a month and giving alms beyond what is obligatory. Ibn Taymiyya provides a long list of rituals, in fact, that are lawful if performed in a lawful manner. And these include night vigils, reciting the Quran, offering up supplications and invocations, traveling to Mecca, and traveling to the mosques of Medina and Jerusalem, and of course various kinds of jihad. Now the primary examples of unlawful rituals mentioned in worship rituals in his treatise Ibadat are innovative spiritual retreats, khalwa, remembrance of God that's done incorrectly, the dhikr, as well as spiritual concerts, or samā. Ibn Taymiyya complains that people go on spiritual retreat to graveyards and caves in the mountains. And the problem with this is that they're out of earshot of an adhan, out of earshot of the call to prayer. So there's no mosque within reasonable distance that they'll hear the prayer call from, and they won't be able to pray the 5 daily prayers. Another place that's dangerous are graveyards. People imagine they see and talk with long dead pious people and even prophets in the graveyards. Ibn Taymiyya says visions and dreams of the pious and the prophets are often in fact satanic impersonations. Nevertheless, he does not condemn spiritual retreats or khalwa entirely. It is permitted and even recommended to isolate oneself in a secluded place to study or to avoid forbidden and unprofitable activities. The Prophet and his companions secluded themselves in mosques. However, one must not isolate oneself to the point of missing prayer in congregation or failing to fulfill other duties. So at the end of this treatise Ibadat, or worship rituals, Ibn Taymiyya comes to Samā, and I read part of that text earlier, this anecdote. And he really has nothing good to say about Samā in this particular treatise, but he's a bit more discriminating in other texts. In fact, he often appropriates a term used by interlocutors, in this case used by Sufis, and then he distinguishes the incorrect version of it from the correct version of it. So in the case of Sama', he says there's a correct spiritual concert, a correct Sama', and there's an unlawful spiritual concert. The lawful spiritual concert is listening to God's verses in the Quran, listening to the prophets, listening to people of knowledge. The unlawful spiritual concert is the clapping, the whistling, and the listening to music found among the pre-Islamic polytheists and the Sufis. So another term that Sufis use, fana, annihilation, Ibn Taymiyya also gives different meanings to this, the correct fana and the incorrect fana. So fana is typically understood by Sufis as an ecstatic experience of passing away in God in the course of spiritual concerts and devotional exercises. So you lose yourself in God, depending how you understand it. Ibn Taymiyya describes this state as so intense that it leads to absence from oneself and others and disappearance into the object of worship. He says that this experience is in fact good insofar as the heart draws near to God, but it's defective inasmuch as one loses awareness of oneself. So he's not in favor of people losing consciousness. Such a state, he says, is excusable, but it's not praiseworthy. It is better to keep a clear mind, as the Prophet and his companions did. Now, Ibn Taymiyya outlines three types of annihilation, or three types of fana. The correct type is the annihilation of willing, worshipping, and loving everything other than God. So you get rid of that. Okay, if you worship, will, or love anything apart from God, that you get rid of. You're annihilating that. You're passing away from it. This is the annihilation attained by the prophets and the saints, according to Ibn Taymiyya. It is worshiping God lawfully, and it does not necessarily involve ecstatic experience. A person in this state, Ibn Taymiyya explains, fears God. This person fears God. This person hopes in God. This person trusts God completely. And this person loves God to the exclusion of all other fears, hopes, trusts, and loves. Now, Ibn Taymiyya's second type of annihilation, or fana, is the annihilation of witnessing, shuhud, everything but God. Okay, Ibn Taymiyya says that this occurs to those who in their weakness of heart become so absorbed in a remembrance of God that they fail to notice anything else. So you become annihilated everything around you apart from God, so it seems. He censures those who imagine that they have become their beloved. In other words, they come under the illusion that they're nothing but God. And he censures those who think that they are witnessing the secret of God's determination of all things and the rulings of God's lordship, that they somehow come into contact with the mysteries of the universe. Such people make annihilation the sole objective of their spiritual journey. They downgrade the importance of the law by failing to differentiate between God's commands and God's prohibition. Ibn Taymiyya counters, he opposes all this, and he says that the correct witnessing is not about gaining union with God, it's not about gaining insight into the secrets of reality, it's about confessing that God is Lord and Creator and obeying God and His messengers. Now, the third type of annihilation he speaks about is the annihilation of the existence of everything but God, the annihilation of wujud, apart from God's wujud, or God's existence. Ibn Taymiyya elaborates how this type of thinking works. He says this annihilation is to bear witness that there is no existence except God, and that the existence of the Creator is the very existence of creation, without distinction between the Lord and the servant. Ibn Taymiyya attributes this view to Ibn al-Arabi and his followers. He rejects it as unbelief. He rejects it outright as unbelief because it collapses the ontological distinction between the Creator and the creature. He argues that one cannot conclude that existence is one from an ecstatic experience of simply feeling that existence is one. So if you have an ecstatic experience and it just feels like you're one with reality and reality is in fact one, just because you perceive that doesn't mean that's what is really the case. So Ibn Taymiyya crosses out the second type, two types of annihilation, that leaves him with the first, the annihilation of willing, worshipping, and loving everything other than God. And it is clear that Ibn Taymiyya does not banish emotion and ecstasy completely, though, from lawful religion. However, he is extremely wary of anything that clouds the mind and leads to incorrect belief, immorality, or idolatry. He believes that worshipping within the confines of the law is the correct path to God. So let's turn now as well to Ibn Taymiyya's views on popular practices. Often popular practices are associated with Sufism as well, especially shrine religion and especially visitation of graves, Ziyaratul Qubur. Now, an important point here is that Ibn Taymiyya was well acquainted with all of this shrine culture. And for example, he writes, I and others used to follow the doctrine of the fathers in visiting graves, Ziyaratul Qubur. We used to uphold the views of the innovators. When it became clear to us what the messenger had wrought, we had to decide whether to follow what God had revealed or to follow what we had found our fathers doing. It was obligatory to follow the messenger. So it seems that Ibn Taymiyya probably participated in shrine religion in early life. He is certainly familiar with it. Even if he didn't participate, he was around it. He knows a lot about it, as is in evidence from his works. He speaks of oaths, vows, supplications. He doesn't name them, he explains all this stuff. So he's very familiar with it. He talks about animal sacrifices. He talks about the names of graves that pilgrims visited. He says that God honors and shows mercy to the saints and the righteous among the dead. He even says amazing wonders happen at graves. He acknowledges, yes, some amazing, karamat occurred. He talks about the graves of the saints being protected from animals, fire, and evil spirits. He even says somewhere that it's advantageous to be buried close to the saints, the graves of the saints. He also maintains that visiting graves is lawful and it can be beneficial. Lawful grave visitation includes greeting the dead, supplicating for them, and visiting them in order to remind oneself of one's mortality. So going to the graves and it reminds you of your mortality, that you're only going to live so long. But what he's completely against is setting out to travel just to visit graves. In other words, if you just happen to be going along your way on business, or you're going to Mecca on pilgrimage, and you happen to notice a graveyard and you stop there, that's fine. But you should not be going to visit the Prophet's tomb. That being your sole intention or your primary intention even for your travel. That's where he draws the line. He's not against visiting graves as a matter of secondary interest. So what's behind all of this? Well, Ibn Taymiyya is most profoundly worried that shrine religion will descend into idolatry and polytheism, into shirk. The crux of the issue is supplication, dua, and intercession, shafa'. Saints in their graves were regarded as repositories of blessing, and according to Ibn Taymiyya, people too readily turn to the dead in their time of need instead of turning to God. Ibn Taymiyya forbids supplicating directly to a dead saint or a prophet because it is outright polytheism. He also prohibits asking a saint or a prophet to intercede before God. He says the proper way to seek access to God is through the Prophet Muhammad. It's to believe in him, not to ask him to intercede, but rather just to believe in him and obey him. So what is Ibn Taymiyya's overall view of Sufism then? I think by now it's clear that his approach is it's fundamentally ethical. It's not about emotion in the first instance. It's about what we do, not how we feel, not the kinds of emotional states we're trying to attain, but how we act day in, day out. It's not about mystical experiences and feelings. Sufism is only correct insofar as it fits within Ibn Taymiyya's vision of the law. And he makes this explicit in a treatise addressing the question, what is Sufism? It's called a Sufiyya wal Fuqara, and it's on the origins of Sufism. And he explains that the term Sufi became well known only after the first 3 Islamic centuries. So it's not something that's part of the early period. He underlines that it's something that arose later, at least that became popular. Sufis first appeared, he said, in the Iraqi city of Basra, which was known for extremes in asceticism and piety. There's even a story, he says, of people swooning and dying from listening to the Quran. Ibn Taymiyya explains then that the Basrans, out of their very intense experiences, what they did is they exercised independent legal reasoning, they exercised ijtihad, to derive rulings concerning worship. Just as their neighbors in Kufa, also in Iraq, their neighbors in Kufa exercised independent reasoning, ijtihad, in matters of governance. So certain Basran rulings, certain Sufi rulings in Basra, deviated from the guidance of the Quran, the Prophet, and the Salaf, and this led to controversy. Some criticized the Sufis as innovators, but others praised them as the best of people after the Prophet. So these two extremes in the Taymiyya says. Some people said the Sufis are just innovators, full stop. There's nothing good about them. Others said, oh, they're just so wonderful. They're the friends of God. They're the best of the people after the prophets. Ibn Taymiyya says, no, we've got to discern the good and the bad here. We have to take a more discriminating approach. He says that Sufi independent reasoning is based, he allows, for example, that Sufi independent reasoning, like the ijtihad of ilham, or their ijtihad is based on intuitive inspiration, can actually be better than a weak hadith, or not a weak hadith, but some methods used by their jurists that are weak. So he's allowing space for ilham, or some kind of inspiration. It can be useful, but it needs to be brought into relation to other considerations. Independent reasoning, ijtihad, does bring some Sufis closer to God, but it does lead others into error and disobedience. So an example of the latter is the innovator Hallaj, who was crucified for his heresy. But some Sufis stayed within the bounds of the law. Ibn Taymiyya affirms al-Junayd and Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, a Hanbali Sufi. And there's a sense in which, for Ibn Taymiyya, Sufism is just like a Sunni law school, a madhab. So Sufism is the product of independent legal reasoning, in the same way that we have the Hanafis and the Maliki and the Shafi'i and the Hanbali law schools. They are also products of ijtihad. Ijtihad as scholarly effort is a good in itself. Mujtahids are rewarded once for their efforts and twice if they're correct. So they're rewarded for their effort even if they get it wrong. And according to Ibn Taymiyya's Salafi approach to the law, the results of mujtahids may be followed if they are correct, that is, if they fall in line with the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Salaf, but they may not be followed if they're wrong. The ijtihad of Sufis is correct as long as it stays within the bounds of revelation and its interpretation by the Salaf. When it ventures outside those bounds, it produces errors, innovations, and unbelief. So what we see here is that Sufism as such doesn't really matter to Ibn Taymiyya. What matters is a spirituality that conforms to the revealed law. So, as other scholars have noted, Ibn Taymiyya does not condemn Sufism completely, but he does measure it with an ethical and legal standard, not with a kind of mystical standard, not with the standards of how emotionally close to God you feel, but rather does it conform to the law. And certainly the unitive experience with God that's often thought to be the goal of the Sufi path falls outside Ibn Taymiyya's legal limits. Now there's this question of whether Ibn Taymiyya is a Sufi himself, and this is the last part of my presentation. The American scholar, as I said before, the American scholar George Makdisi argued in a 1973 article that Ibn Taymiyya is a Sufi of the Qadiriyya order, named after Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. So what was Makdisi's evidence? A lot of it is external evidence, not to Ibn Taymiyya himself. Okay, so the first thing is Makdisi presented spiritual initiation chains, or chain of silsila, chain of sheikhs that led up to Ibn Taymiyya, and this tied back to the Hanbali Sufi Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, after whom the Qadiriyya Sufi order is named. Makdisi also found two statements in which Ibn Taymiyya is reported to have said that he donned the Sufi cloak, the khirka. He took on the khirka of Abdul Qadir. Now, donning the cloak is an initiation ritual into a Sufi chain of spiritual authority. Another thing that Makdisi mentions is that Ibn Taymiyya calls Abdul Qadir our sheikh in a commentary on a treatise Abdul Qadir wrote, Abdul Qadir Jilani. And then Makdisi also notes that Ibn Taymiyya was buried in a Sufi cemetery. So it seems that he would be perhaps a Sufi. Now, Makdisi's claim is sometimes repeated as established fact in both academic and popular writing. However, several scholars have cast serious doubt on Makdisi's evidence. The spiritual initiation chains and the statements about donning the Sufi cloak do not appear in Ibn Taymiyya's own texts. Okay, these are texts around in the 14th century, around Ibn Taymiyya and after Ibn Taymiyya lived, that talk about these things. So, as a general matter of fact, initiation chains are often forged. So these particular chains can be forged as well. The cloak donning statements, donning the khirqa, could also have been forged. Ibn Taymiyya himself criticizes this practice, so how would he let himself be the subject of it? And there's also no evidence in his corpus that he participated in it as well. What about him mentioning Abdul Qadir as our sheikh in the commentary on Abdul Qadir's work? The problem here is there's nothing more about Ibn Taymiyya being a Sufi or really affirming Abdul Qadir as a Sufi sheikh in that particular treatise. Another thing, it's not even clear there was such a thing as a Qadiriyya order, Sufi order at the time of Ibn Taymiyya that you could join, because the Qadiriyya order did not just emerge with Abdul Qadir Jilani. It took quite a while to form. So, yeah, he may not have been able to join that order. What might not have been established well enough yet to join. Finally, Ibn Taymiyya didn't call himself a Sufi. We have no evidence that he calls himself a Sufi. And the significance of being buried in a Sufi cemetery is not clear. It could be that his family, as I mentioned earlier, he was engaged in Sufi activities. Maybe it was the family cemetery. So, Makdisi's case is not built on that solid of evidence. But despite this, as I just hinted, it seems reasonable to suggest that Ibn Taymiyya did participate in organized Sufism in his early years, and perhaps he, as I said, emerged within a Sufi context, a Sufi family, or his Hanbali family participated in Sufi activities of various kinds. We also saw earlier that he witnessed the Sufi dhikr in Samā sessions of the young man. He was well acquainted with shrine religion, and he acknowledges openly that he accepted traveling to graves to visit them before he deemed it a religious innovation. So he had a bit of a conversion on that point. And he even appreciated reading Ibn al-Arabi's works until he was 40 years old, which is quite a late age, all considered. So given all of this, it is apparent that Ibn Taymiyya grew up and gained intellectual maturity in a Sufi environment. Ibn Taymiyya likely participated in some Sufi and shrine rituals early on in his life, but it's very unlikely that he participated in such activities in his later years, especially given his sharp criticism of spiritual concerts and shrine religion. He also had grown very wary of the ecstatic aspects of religion that are usually thought to be central to Sufism. So it goes too far, I think, to call Ibn Taymiyya a Sufi in the usual sense of the term. If Ibn Taymiyya is to be called a Sufi, it must be strictly according to his own vision of a highly ethicized spirituality, a spirituality prescribed by the revealed law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Has anyone got any questions to ask?
I have some comments. Just need to ask question.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
You can make a comment. Yeah, you can make a comment.
Could you please, I would like to, for this thing, if you just stop the video, I don't like so to share with anyone. Yeah, just inside this one, that's it. Don't record this.
It's live on Facebook.
Really?
Yeah.